The picture I should show you, in a way, is a paving stone in the middle of Adelbert, which is the street that runs down the middle of the campus in Case Western Reserve. Because I was walking down Adelbert one day wondering how to do my PhD research without too much intrusion and to do it in authentic relationship. And the idea that I didn't do research on the people, but with the people, that I invited them to be participants of their own lives and relationships, occurred to me at a particular moment when I stepped on a paving stone. And I've always remembered that. That'll come later, the picture that's just come up. And it's very curious because I didn't know anything about participatory research at this time. This idea came to me, it must have been in the air, but it still came to me. And curiously, Rajesh Tandon was on the same program as me, of course, working very strongly within the PAR tradition. He was a few years after me, but we did meet. When I got back to the UK, I developed what I'd done with John Heron into a practice of cooperative inquiry. And our work was rooted in humanistic psychology and education, so it has a different root from many PAR people. And the idea was to create a community of inquiry with a focus on issues of concern in their personal or professional lives. I can give you some examples in a minute. And to engage quite intensively in cycles of action and reflection, going through what we've called the extended epistemology. So we're emphasizing experience as the grounding of this, of presentation as a form of knowing, which is in some kind of art or poetry or dance or movement, intellectual propositional knowing, which is the theories that we develop, and finally practical knowing. And of course practical knowing that's what it's all about, is to change practice, to change our lives. And of course at that time, as we began to do this work, we realized that there was a range of work across the world that was called participative research or participatory action, all these different kind of forms. And I actually published Human Inquiry in 1981 as my first attempt to encompass the field. So in those early days, we're back in the 1980s and 90s, John and I established a holistic medical project where we set up with 16 physicians or general practices to explore the practice, the theory and practice of holistic medicine, which was very much a political hot potato at that time. And we worked through, I think it was 8 cycles of action and reflection over about a year, with the doctors exploring different ways of being more holistic, and whatever that meant was part of what we gathered. And it's really interesting to see, because some people criticize cooperative inquiry as only dealing with a small group of people, but out of that inquiry was developed the British Holistic Medical Association and the Marylebone Centre Trust, which was an innovative general practice, and it's still relevant and making changes to this day. So about this time, I also established with my colleague Judy Marshall and others the Centre for Action Research, which John has already mentioned. And there we were doing inquiry with PhD students who were bringing their life issues. So we had the privilege of working with several Black British people, one particularly asking the question, how do I as a professional Black woman not just survive but thrive in this essentially racist community? We worked on issues of gender, many different issues, but one that comes to mind is a young woman. How do young women behave and thrive in male-dominated organizations? We had another PhD exploring communities of crisis after catastrophes like shootings and bombings, and so on and so forth. And quite independently of this, there were other ones that came up through our influence. So one of the ones I always found very interesting, although I actually lost the paper, was a self-started inquiry with women who referred to themselves as obese and post-obese, and their relationship with their medical practitioners, which is, you can imagine, often fraught, and how to develop agency in that relationship. And my colleague in New Zealand is conducting a series of feminist action research projects using cooperative inquiry into the use of period tracking apps and the benefits and manipulations that come out of that. So another thing we developed at this time, which led to what I'm doing now, we developed a master's in responsibility and business practice. I was in a school of management, and emphasized management, not business. I was in a school of management, and we were invited, or it happened through various things, to establish a holistic master's, a responsibility master's, a sustainability master's, and we called it responsibility and business practice. Judy and I and my other colleague Jill Coleman, we designed this whole master's program as an exercise in action research, as an exercise in cooperative inquiry. So we had intentional cycles of action reflection through the various workshops that we held for essentially part-time people. And each student was also engaging in some form of first, second, or third person action research in their organization. And the people we were working with were all absolute pioneers in their field. Sometimes quite lone workers in the field, sometimes very young, some of them quite established. So that was very interesting to do. And that program is still going, even though the master's has completed. The network that we established has kept going. And one of the things we did on the Masters in Responsibility and Business Practice was to take up students to Schumacher College and have a week engaging in deep ecology, if you like. We found that you couldn't just think about establishing sustainable businesses unless there was some proper rooting in the planet. And this introduced me very thoroughly to notions of Gaia and to seeing increasingly the catastrophe, the ecological catastrophe that is happening to our planet and to ourselves and to the other communities of people, beings on the earth. So that led me to a whole exploration of how could we live in a different kind of way. Not so much in the practical kind of way, because I was also interested in how do we respond to that? And recently I've just been reading the book of Escobar and his colleagues on relationality, and he starts this with, something is terribly wrong, an anguish at the heart of modern living. The fundamental story of modernism is a part of the problem. So there's a practical philosophical question here about how we relate to the earth. And that is increasing what I've been dealing with since I formally retired from academia. So I wrote a while ago, the catastrophe of our time has deep roots in the worldview of Western worldview. We can argue over the details, but broadly, the foundational pathologies of Western civilization, dualism, the splitting of human and nature, and the lust for power and control, or the ideology of mastery, as Amitav Ghosh puts it, had their origins way back. I won't read all this. Way back in monotheism, in the formalism of the Greek philosophers, in institutional Christianity, in the Enlightenment. It goes really way back, and it was given an extra consequential twist when this worldview was twinned with late-stage capitalism and coupled with a materially exploitive technology powered by fossil fuels. And the pervasiveness of this is reflected, going back to my work with the master's program. The questions we were discussing and arguing and researching together in the 1990s are still on the agenda. They're still what they're talking about at COP, whichever number they've got to at the moment. They have not been resolved. We thought we had a radical pioneering action research sustainability program, and it was, but its impact has been much less than I want to. So the consequence of this is that the beings of the world other than humans are seen as having no subjectivity, no consciousness or intelligence, no intrinsic purpose, value or meaning. And this worldview tells us that mind and the physical reality are separate. Humans, modern humans, and humans alone have the capacity for rational thinking and action. And one of the other things Escobar tells us in his book, which I think is really interesting, is how that idea of humans has been formed within a masculine European image. And they are insisting there are many ways of being human, and it's a question of how we tell stories to each other. So I think that's an interesting recent thing. So after several things, let me move on. I teamed together with some other people, other colleagues that I was meeting across the world. Freya Matthews, who's a panpsychic philosopher in Australia, and Andreas Weber, who is a radical biologist. And together we put together a program of cooperative inquiry with the more than human world, with rivers specifically. Panpsychic philosophy or contemporary animism argues that the cosmos from the beginning is infused with sentience and intention. So it's not a question of separating mind and matter as the Western worldview, but seeing them as intimately related from the very beginning. All beings have an interiority, an impulse towards their own self-expression. And this world is alive. It's not just alive, but it's sentient. It's full of meaning and poetic presence. There's an innerness, mind, sentience, subjectivity, which suffuses physical reality, and which, of course, in this argument, the Western world refuses to see. But the world does seek us out, even though the Western culture has tended to monopolize the culture. So this means that if we invoke the world as a sentient presence, if we call on the world not as a set of things, which is what we do habitually every day, or I do, we may be graced with a response. The world may respond to us, not in human language. As the Australian elder said to the anthropologist, "The river doesn't speak English, you know," he said it in a different accent. But it's a poetic process. It's through the material form in the language of things. Animals and birds appear. The breeze ruffles the trees, cloud formations change, all in ways that are apposite and immediately synchronous with our invitation. So I found this really exciting because it was bringing together my work with cooperative inquiry, my long-standing commitment to that, and my ecological commitments. We could see these two coming together, and it's a radical move to argue that we can do research with the more than human world. So we've set up a series of cooperative inquiries through Schumacher College. We've done 4 at the moment, 5 I suppose in a different way. Next one is planned for next spring, asking the question, what does it mean to live on Earth, not as a collection of objects, but as a community of living, sentient, communicative beings? How do we learn to invoke such a world? How do adults experience rivers and water places and living and responsible? How can we intentionally cultivate skills and ways of knowing, being and doing that enable this ability to respond to the more than human world? And I have to add at this point, because the comment is coming in the back of my head, this seems pretty crazy to a standard sort of well-educated white European. This is a stupid way of thinking about the world. You know, everything tells us that this isn't true. But once we let go of that, which takes a little while, we find that it isn't. It is true. It does have a grounding in reality. So what we've done is we've invited human persons to join in collaboration to invoke the presence of rivers, and this is online all around the world, to establish an active mode of communication with our Earth. So we're seeing all things, and that's where my photograph comes in. If you could, can we see it again? Or shall I, I've got it here. There it is. So this is the spot by the River Frome, which is coming on the left-hand side of the picture, and the River Avon, which is going on the right-hand side of the picture. And interestingly, this tree opposite is a big willow tree. Just thinking of, it's not quite the same willow, is it? Or is it? We were dealing with Jenny, and the railway train goes across here, which rather spoils the bucolic atmosphere. It's taken in my sit spot at the confluence of the River Avon and Frome, where I've been visiting regularly in the past 5 years. And this is a practice we invite other people on the living waters to engage in. After everybody's introduced themselves and the river they intend to work with, the participants work again in classic cooperative inquiry way in inquiry groups of about 6 persons and a facilitator. They engage in cycles of action reflection, visiting the rivers once a week to explore different forms of invocation, like loving attention, meditation, ceremony, song, gift giving. They find an initial presentational form of that in writing or photography or video or poetry or drawing. And they post this on Google Drive, where we have a folder. And they read each other people's accounts and meet weekly on Zoom to share and critique experiences and make sense together. And then they decide, well, what will we do next time? Sometimes they keep doing with their individual cycles. Sometimes they decide to do one ceremony, for example. And that's the bare bones. This is an intimate, living, worldview-changing experience for many people. And it's a challenge because, as I said, it does question taken for granted at a very deep level. One of the things, again, reading Escobar, he's emphasizing if we want to change our worldview, it's an extraordinary radical thing to do. But we do find people moving from some sort of resistance to some way of saying, oh, isn't the river beautiful, but it's still a subject-object relationship, to, as they sit there or walk there or sing or what they do, they slip under the surface and begin to go deeper and see a sentient embodied world of which their own animal body is a part of. And there's often intense feelings of pleasure and gratitude and maybe wonder at the sheer beauty of it all. And so for some people, there's a curious juxtaposition of the ordinary and the extraordinary. This is just every day, but it's amazing. And some people develop quite complicated narratives or psychic response to the story of the world speaking directly to them. And then sometimes on occasion, the world responds with some clearly ontopoetic is the philosophical word we use for this. Moments of grace when the world and its beings actively gesture back in invocation. And I've got some stories of that, but I think probably a little bit too long. But let me just give you one example. When we did the first one of these cooperative inquiries, I went down to the river. Actually, we stopped calling it the river, we call it river. We went down to river and I introduced myself and I called to the river and I said, I'd like to have your blessing on this project that we're just starting, which is about communicating with you and being part of you. And I didn't know what kind of, I had no expectations at all. And immediately after I called, 6 kingfishers flew past in different formats. You know, you're lucky if you see one. 6 flew past. And for me, that is, it's experientially rooted. And I can say, well, I was making this up, but you can't say you're making it up because the evidence is so experientially self-justifying, self-supporting. Of course, we have to be careful not to fool ourselves, not to engage in wish fulfillment. But, you know, we have pages and pages of experiential narrative written by our participants, hours and hours of Zoom recorded discussions. The experiences are deeply felt, unassailably authentic. They have their own authority and offer intimations of a world quite different from the materialist, brute world in which we moderns are socialized. So it seems from this that experience of a sensitive, sentient, responsive, communicative world are available not just to indigenous peoples, although we have to be very careful about not stealing other people's culture, but to human persons willing to put in the time, the attention, and the risk of their taken for granted self in doing this and opening themselves to that possibility. So I've got more stories I can tell if people are interested, but I think that's probably enough for now.